Good morning and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan, and today we're going to be continuing our coverage of the Boston mayoral primary, which is set to take place on September 21st, ahead of the city's November general election. Former Mayor Marty Walsh has recently left the seat to serve as President Joe Biden's labor secretary, and former City Council President Kim Janey is now serving as acting mayor. And she and several other candidates are running in September. And today we will be talking with one of those candidates, City Councilor Michelle Wu. Councilor Wu has served on the City Council for 7 years, acting as a proponent for paid parental leave, language access, and healthcare equity. As a daughter of immigrants, she says that her experience has taught her how big of a disconnect there is between constituents who need the most help and their government. It's also important to note that if she is elected, Wu would be the first woman and the first Asian American to be elected as mayor. In fact, until Janey, Boston has had nothing but white men as their mayors. But that is not the only thing that would separate Wu from former Mayor Walsh. Now, Walsh's tenure was marred by several scandals as well as disappointment on the left, especially over what activists have described as his failure to deliver for the working class, low income, and people who are unhoused. He has also come under fire for standing in the way of efforts to rein in police brutality in Boston. The Appeal's Jerry Ionelli wrote this recently following the publication of footage showing Boston police officers bragging about using excessive force on demonstrators during protests following the killing of George Floyd last year. Wu has a different idea for Boston's future. And with that being said, I'm so pleased to be joined now by City Councilor Michelle Wu. Councilor, thank you so much for being here today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me, Alana.
So why don't you start out by telling us about how your time as mayor would be different from former Mayor Walsh's tenure?
I was the first candidate to announce in this race. There are 6 of us now. I've been at this for a little bit of time, having announced a challenge to the incumbent back in September. This is a moment in our city's history, in our country's history, where we have to really think about transformational change as a recovery to this crisis and to address all the issues that, frankly, were at crisis level long before COVID-19. I'm someone who never, ever, growing up, thought that I would run for office. I'm the daughter of immigrants, and I only started on this path when my mom began to struggle with mental illness. And so I raised my 2 sisters in that situation, became her primary caregiver, and my family has found a foothold, a sense of stability, a sense of opportunity and community in Boston. But we have had to fight to get there. And there are so many other families who are falling through gaps. We have incredible resources in the city. We have financial resources. We have the activism. We have expertise and ideas. It's just about being bold, doing more, and making sure that we're centering people in all that we do.
So, Councilor, I want to start by digging into your platform on public safety, because this is something that is close in the public eye right now, especially following the killing of Dante Wright. We know that this is an issue where Walsh has been lacking. The Appeal obtained footage of the Boston Police Department, as I mentioned above, officers in that department bragging about apparent misconduct against protesters, against racism, during protests against racism and police violence. Mayor Walsh called these videos difficult to watch, but he didn't really do much else. In fact, he later vetoed an ordinance that would have strictly regulated the use of rubber bullets, tear gas, and other lethal weapons. So talk to us about what Mayor Walsh got wrong about policing and safety and what you would do differently and why that plan is right.
So we often find ourselves reacting to individual situations. We're talking about accountability after the fact, having to respond to, in this case, footage that the city's own police department attorneys and other attorneys withheld from public records requests again and again and again until there was independent investigative journalism to uncover this and a lawsuit that drew this out. But this is far more than just being ready after the fact to ensure that there's accountability. There is a culture that we need to change within our policing, within our public safety departments, around the importance of transparency and centering our actions on building trust with community. We are far from there at this moment. And in Boston, in these last couple of days, we've been dealing with just the city's conversations have been and really centering on so many institutions and residents reeling with the revelations that a former head of the police union had credible evidence of inappropriate sexual assault of minors, and was allowed not only to continue on the job with a cover-up about what had happened, but advanced to leadership within that position. And the city, until just recently, has refused to discuss releasing the internal affairs files. So just today, there was a reversal of that, and a commitment that there will be a process now to release those files to come. But this, again, is a signal and one more example that we need a transformative approach to public safety, one that centers public health first and foremost, on making sure that we are responding to situations in a way that truly serves residents, that delivers health and safety. I've proposed and have been on the appeal before, talking about a plan that many other cities have implemented to change our crisis response, that rather than showing up with armed law enforcement for residents who are living with mental illness or unhoused or living with substance use, we should have a public health-based response first. And that's where our investments should go. This is about how we use our resources in a way that serves communities. And all of those line up with making sure that we're investing in stability and opportunity, in access to jobs and supports for community and mental health and social emotional supports, rather than waiting until yet another incident needs a conversation about accountability.
I'm really glad you asked that you mentioned that, because that leads to my next question, which is, you talk about having sort of an alternative to policing. And you mentioned on your website that one of your commitments is to divert 911 calls having to do with homelessness and mental health. Do you envision diverting funding away from the police department in order to do that? And if so, what percentage of the police's budget would you shrink in order to do that? I know some candidates have committed to shrinking the budget by at least 10%. Is that something that you would commit to as well? And if not, how do you envision funding that?
So in this moment, our police budget is, as with most other departments across the city, 95% plus of that funding is going to personnel, right? It is about positions and benefits related to that. And so we're not talking about sort of slashing line items arbitrarily. In fact, I had voted against the last budget that had been presented to the city council about a year ago at this point, where there was a move to slightly cut the line item for overtime without a plan to actually deliver changes either on how that overtime decrease would be realized, or on how impact would be realized from investing that pool of funding elsewhere. So for me, this is less about picking a number and more about committing to a shift in how our organizational structures, how we are building out the capacity among this ecosystem of public safety and public health to actually deliver that impact, having the plans to do that. And so it's one thing to say we're going to pick a percentage. I do believe we need to shift personnel, as I said, to providing services for those with mental health and from a public health angle. But this is about having the plans to get that set, ensuring that we are backing this up and being able to deliver the impact and not just picking a number.
So I want to switch to something that you've been a real champion of, which is transit equity. You've pointed out in Boston that Black bus riders spend 64 more hours on average each year on stalled buses than white riders due to transit inequity. So how do you plan to address this as mayor?
There's so much that we could do. First and foremost is just to really ground everyone in conversations about public transportation as a public good. Boston has had a history of leading the way over our hundreds of years as a city government of standing up for public education, right? The first public school anywhere in the country, right here in our city. First public park anywhere in the country. First public library we invested in Boston. And similarly, we need to recognize that every person who's able to rely on safe, convenient, affordable, I would say free public transportation is another person that reduces traffic on our streets and also is cleaning the air with less pollution going up from cars. And so it benefits everyone for us to invest in public transportation. The mayor of Boston has a huge advocacy platform to push the state government in the ways that they are controlling decisions, whether it's on funding and fare policy, whether it's on the speed at which new stations are being constructed and in what way, whether it's on, I've been advocating for getting rid of a push to have a new fare collection technology that would cost nearly $1 billion and would create tremendous problems for us when it comes to profiling of enforcing that new fare collection system, racial profiling issues that we have seen pervasive among various agencies that have this kind of enforcement. And instead, we should be advocating for Boston's interests to be front and center. At the city level, purely within municipal authority, city government controls how we allocate street space. So we should be moving fast to create the best possible experience for bus riders. This is where we have the equity impacts. This is where it's most cost efficient to do so. We can designate bus-only lanes that will dramatically speed up bus service, allow for the routes to run much more quickly. We can change our signalization of traffic lights so that there's priority for transit vehicles. We can make sure we're investing in safe infrastructure for cyclists and pedestrians and connecting all of these modes of transportation together. And we can pilot fare-free public transportation. I'm really excited that 3 years ago, I'd been talking about this idea and met with a tremendous amount of pushback about how impractical it was, how expensive it would be. And yet, less than a year after I first proposed the idea in Boston, another city in Massachusetts had already implemented it. Then Mayor Dan Rivera, after our conversations, decided to pilot that with his authority as mayor in the city of Lawrence. It has been transformational. We can do the same in Boston. We are seeing Worcester also take the same steps. And I know Boston, from purely the city level, could pilot and choose a few routes to make free to demonstrate the impact and expand from there.
And is that how the pilot has worked in other places, that it's a few routes that are free, or is it certain neighborhoods? How does that work?
Yeah, so in Lawrence, it was the 3 routes that run through the downtown core that the mayor and the city invested in essentially replacing the fares that had been collected to guarantee free fares for 2 years. And there's some story. I mean, not only did we see a huge jump in the data at a time when public transit ridership was falling all across the country, it immediately within a month went up by double digits in Lawrence after this change. We also heard stories of bus riders who had driven the same routes for decades, for the first time meeting residents who had lived in those communities for decades, but who hadn't been able to afford getting on the bus and instead had been rationing their trips to the grocery store for healthcare or walking or finding a different way. And so it has been transformational, and it is the foundation for how we need to lay the groundwork for a recovery that is equitable and just.
Okay, so let's talk housing. As you know, issues of housing unaffordability and inequity have been critical issues in Boston and subject to criticism of the past administration. And these problems are only going to get worse as the so-called evictions cliff is reached. And that's the date when eviction protections expire and landlords start trying to kick out tenants who've fallen behind on rent amid the pandemic. One thing that Mayor Walsh supported publicly when he was in office was the idea of a right to counsel, basically to provide tenants with a lawyer when they're facing eviction proceedings. So is this something that you support? And if so, how will you work to get it enacted in Boston?
Absolutely. We know that it makes a huge difference. And in these small interactions that happen between the court system, an individual landlord, an individual tenant, it makes all the difference in the world who has legal representation in that moment. And to make sure that we are providing not just the legal framework, but also the funding for that to happen is something that's really important to continue, not just in this situation, but when it comes to undocumented immigrants, our residents facing deportation proceedings. This is a huge difference maker as well in making sure that the city is lifting up, supporting, moving forward with legal representation. It goes way beyond that, right? Ideally, we do not want any tenant to have to be in that situation to be able to depend on legal representation to then make back what is already a tremendous amount of time, stress, trauma, costs, usually out of pocket, already invested when we should be stabilizing people in their housing to begin with. And so I've been pushing forward with making sure that we're looking at every tool we have on the city side, including through our capital budget, and the potential to float green and social bonds to directly invest in affordable housing constructed by the city and run by the city that would also be climate resilient. And so we have seen a huge boom in Boston pre-pandemic. There was just a flow of wealth and development and jobs coming to the city, surpluses through our budget, unheard of before. And yet our most destabilized communities were not made more whole through this growth in our city. We have seen our population boom, but the number of kids living in Boston is actually lower than a couple decades ago because families have been displaced, families with kids who can't afford to stay in our city. And so we need to be very intentional through this process of the recovery, through a period where there will be funding available, federal relief funding flowing down to our schools, to city government, for housing, for stability. It can't just be more Band-Aids on situations. We have to truly invest in changing the framework and reimagining what's possible for housing justice.
And sort of a related question too, when you talk about how, people during this time are not being taken care of, I think about the criticism that the Walsh administration received after cracking down on a homeless encampment in South End, which neighbored the Boston Medical Center and many of the city's largest substance use and homeless service providers. So if elected mayor, would you approve of sweeps of homeless encampments?
Absolutely not. I mean, I spoke up then that the first thing is that even by describing the problem as we do in Boston right now, which is the Mass and Cass situation, referring to the intersection of Massachusetts Avenue and Melnia Cass Boulevard, which is the basically a 1 mile radius around which all of our medication assisted treatment for opioid use, a large chunk of the emergency shelter beds, so many of the services that patients living with substance use have to access, sometimes on a daily basis as required for medication assisted treatment. This is all concentrated in a 1 mile radius in the city. And we need to push to make sure that access is available all across our city, ideally all across the region as well, but even through Boston, working through our community health centers to make that access available in other parts of the city so people don't have to travel and pay for transportation to get there every single day in large numbers in a space that is not safe for patients, for residents. But when we describe it as just a Mass and Cass situation, instead of a citywide plan that is needed to address residents who are unhoused, to address substance use, when we think of it as just one intersection, the solution often is described as just then removing things from that intersection, right? Pushing people out or finding ways to respond to constituent services requests as quickly as possible when we're not addressing the underlying issue, which is that we need to solve this healthcare problem, a lack of services, a lack of beds and access in more places across the city. And then even more fundamental, a housing problem. That even when patients, and I've spoken with many providers who treat patients in this area and beyond, that even when patients get on a good plan for their physical health and are receiving treatment, that as long as they're not able to come back to a safe roof over their head, a home they can call their own, no foothold then to be able to find a different pathway to a job or stability in other parts of their life, it becomes a cyclical situation with the opiate crisis. So the underlying issue is that we need to have low threshold supportive housing for everyone in our city. Some of our organizations in Boston are doing an amazing job building that and moving away from an emergency shelter only model to long-term housing that is supported and wrapped around with services. We need to make sure that that is the focus and not pushing people away from certain parts of the city and sort of just sweeping a problem away from plain sight. We need to see the humanity in everyone in this situation, but also make sure that we are providing a comprehensive set of solutions that actually addresses root causes.
Well, Councillor Wu, thank you so much for joining us today. That about wraps up our time, and best of luck in this race.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Well, thanks again for joining us here on the Appeal Live. We will be continuing to cover this race in Boston, so stay tuned. You can continue to follow us on the Appeal on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time.